Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, this entire week, we've been reflecting on what's happened in Afghanistan and continues to very much happen on the ground there in Afghanistan ever since the U.S. withdrew from the country, as well as other NATO forces as well that were part of the coalition that had been involved in Afghanistan for about 2 decades, ever since the fall of the original Taliban regime back right after the 9/11 attacks. At this point in time, we've discussed the U.S. role and the U.K. role, and we're now going to try to discuss the Middle East role and or the effect on the Middle East, more importantly, of this U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in the way that it's happened and the lessons that Middle Eastern countries may have learned from this. Now, there's a lot of talk about the fact that the U.S. May not be a trustworthy partner anymore, as it's so proven. At least that's the argument on some people's part. There's also then concern about countries like Iran and what kind of a role they may play in the region going forward, even though we know there are talks between Iran and even Saudi Arabia at this point in time behind the scenes, because there seems to be an overall understanding that the U.S. is stepping back from the region, which may or may not be a good thing for the region, but in some people's eyes it is a good thing, where the region can then handle its own issues, hopefully, going forward. Is what's happened in Afghanistan going to be a good thing for the region? But then, of course, most importantly, is it a good thing for the people of Afghanistan? And that must always remain our central focus, as I've said before in previous shows as well. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Nazif Shahrani, who is a professor of anthropology in Central Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. He's joining us this morning from Bloomington, Indiana. Joining us this morning from Dearborn, Michigan, is Dr. Ronald Stockton, who is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Ronald and Nazif, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Nazif, I'd like to start with you firstly. As I said, there's been a lot written, a lot said ever since what's happened in Afghanistan has happened. What kind of an effect do you think this will have on the Middle East?
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Obviously, what has happened in Afghanistan in the last few days has been surprising, unfortunately, to most people, including the claims that U.S. government is making. And obviously, it has taken by surprise a lot of people in the Middle East as well. But there are some positive signs, possibly, that Taliban may have changed, although that needs to be proven. And if so, how they have changed. But one indication that we have is people in Afghanistan are scared, worried, desperate. And as you can see also in showing the situation in Kabul International Airport is a good indication of that. But also streets and countryside are also filled with fear, with anxiety, with possibility of unanticipated developments. But the hope is, based on the little that the Taliban have revealed, that they are going to give amnesty, they are not going to restrict women from being able to work, be educated, and take part in the governance and so forth, although there are counterindications also going on, that those are hopeful signs, and that they're seeing this as a challenge, and the challenge is to be able to form a more inclusive government and more appropriate government. If all of those things happen, maybe Middle East doesn't have to have too much fear. But at the moment, they are going to be faced with refugee crisis. A lot of people are not only trying to get out of the country by airplanes from Kabul International Airport, but also across Iran into Turkey, and possibly people are trying to get into the north to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, and no doubt many also will be heading out to Pakistan. So that refugee crisis at least be one of the challenges that will be a consequence of what's happened in Afghanistan the last few days.
Ronald, simply from the point of view of the U.S. role in the region and what the U.S. image and or even legacy, if that's the correct word to use here, will be then going forward, do you think it is that the U.S. cannot be trusted as a partner?
As an American of my age, I have traumatic reactions to this. having flashbacks to 1975 and the end of the Vietnam War. I think the United States has suffered a major blow to its reputation. I'm thinking about how a historian 25 years from now will write a book on what happened. And as Nazif says, there are good signs so far after a week. There are no reports of massacres. There's no report of 250,000 refugees pouring into a neighboring country. I'm thinking of what happened when there was a dramatic reversal of fortunes in Iran. There's not been such a thing since Iran, where on one day, Iran was a staunch ally of the United States, and on the next day, it was a staunch opponent of the United States. We've not seen such a reversal of a position since then. I think what happened when Iran flipped from one side to the other was that it destabilized the whole region. The Iran-Iraq war followed on. The Gulf states were terrified. The Americans sent a fleet into the Gulf. I am not sure what's going to happen now. I think the United States is going to focus heavily upon its most reliable allies as they see it. That would be Israelis and some of the Gulf states, and maybe Egypt and Jordan. But I think there's definitely a pullback from the region by the Americans. And I think it's not a matter of not being able to rely on the Americans. I think it's the Americans redefining what they see as their role in the region and recognizing the limits on what you can actually achieve.
We're also joined now by Dr. Sultan Barakat, who is the founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. He's also the professor of politics and post-war recovery studies at the University of York. He's joining us today from Doha in Qatar. Sultan, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us. What are your thoughts from your vantage point from right here in the Middle East about how the Middle East is feeling about what's happened in Afghanistan, the U.S. legacy, etc.?
I think the failing in Afghanistan was mutual. It wasn't just the responsibility of the United States, but also the local government and the system that the United States have supported in the name of democratization in Afghanistan. The way the president left the palace, while he was very well aware of the deal that is being struck between his side, the Taliban, the United States, to ensure an orderly transition, is something that the United States could do nothing about it. It was his individual decision to make way. He was probably very much in his mind, it was playing the way the former president in the 1990s was taken down and killed and hanged, and he was just running for his life. So I don't think we could just say it's all United States responsibility. There has been no way for the United States to exit Afghanistan in a dignified manner. And I think it's very important to remember that this exit, although we are witnessing it these days in its most, it has materialized in those days. There has been work on this ever since the killing of Osama bin Laden in March 2011. The United States took a very clear, if a little bit subconscious decision, not vocal, that its time in Afghanistan has got to end. And the opening of the office in Doha in 2013 was, to my mind, the beginning of the transformation of the movement. The movement has shown intentions to negotiate early on from 2002, but at that time it was not accepted. By 2013, there were more signals that the movement would be willing to reach political solution, would be willing to compromise over some civil rights issues and so on.
Right.
And that has been going on ever since. So the whole contact with the movement, the opening of its office outside Afghanistan, the various waves of negotiation. I think all of those have helped work out the various outstanding issues, which we now see the result of it. Our colleagues have referred to earlier, the fact that they've entered without major bloodshed is a huge improvement on what was expected from everybody else. The way they present their objectives, etc. All of these are important advances. And now the real test is how they can move forward and how the world will be able to work with them. I think boycotting them and trying to pretend that they don't exist, or if they exist, they have to obey exactly how the rest of the world see things, is not going to help. And there is a lot of that. We've learned a lot of lessons from the 1990s position.
Indeed. If I wanted to bring you back in and ask you then, do you think that what's happened in Afghanistan can then be impetus for the region to take the leadership of the region into its own hands? And I'm not saying that, of course, the U.S. controlled everything in the region, but I mean that will this be finally the realization on the part of everyone, even those states that do not get along with each other, that, hey, after Afghanistan, we've realized that we really are on our own, and that this can then be in some ways a positive thing?
I think the region has a lot to think about, and I wish we had, as a region, been interested in our own welfare and should have perhaps reduced our dependency on outside world. But the reality is, since World War II, United States has become a new kind of empire that is empire by invitation, or empire one would call also, although they themselves call it empire of trust, but my take on that is it's empire of deception, that they have been creating conditions in the region, in different countries at different times, to be essentially invited or invite themselves to intervene. And I think one lesson that the Middle East as a whole needs to sort of take seriously from Afghanistan is that America has consistently picked the wrong partners, or partners who have been not willing to work for their own country, but to work for themselves and maybe perhaps work for the United States interest. And as a result, it has led into failure. I mean, the experience that we have seen in the last 20 years of bringing a bunch of technocrats, plus, of course, getting engaged with so-called warlords or commanders from the jihadi era, all of whom had different issues in terms of their relationship with the people, as well as their conduct during their political lives in the country. And that made up a government that is kleptocratic, that they were quite aware of the nature of these individuals and their unreliability, their lack of commitment to their own people, but they went along and kept supporting them instead of reforming, instead of helping reform the political system. To begin with, I think America saw the Afghanistan issue essentially as a security issue for itself, and its entire policy during the past 20 years has been war on terror. And while, in fact, the problem is a political problem of terrorism from the very beginning was a political problem. They never treated it as a political problem and worked towards bringing a political system that would work for the people of that region and bring about some kind of stability and true democracy. Instead, they hired and empowered essentially a bunch of kleptocrats. And of course, the result has been what we have witnessed. And people are sick and tired of this kind of intervention where either autocratic regimes or ineffective kleptocratic regimes are supported by the United States, empowered, and then at the end sort of saying, well, we helped them, we created this security force of 350,000. We give them weapons, we give them training. They should have done it on their own. While they knew Ghani and company or Karzai and company were not capable of doing these things. And I think they left the people.
I mean, just because,
lurch.
unfortunately, the clock is best of us, I do apologize for cutting you off. I wanted to give Ronald and Sultan proper time for their final comments. Ronald, I'll go to you first. On the issue then of nation building, right? So the original goal in Afghanistan was quite clear. It was after 9/11. It was a reaction to that. It was the defeat of Al-Qaeda. Was it a mistake, do you believe, for the U.S. to have remained after that and not just have handed the country back to the Afghan people at that point itself, instead of being and remaining involved for 2 decades?
After September 11th, every American thought there should be a reaction to that. I am the least warlike person you'll ever encounter, and yet I felt that we had to get rid of that regime and remove that any regime that would allow an attack like this to occur had to be removed from power. So once we decided to remove the Taliban regime from power, it became a question then of what do you do? And my wife and I were just talking. She asked me, is there any successful occupation? Well, Germany and Japan both were successful occupants after World War II. They both created regimes that were viable and strong. And that involved direct American government for a period of a few years. But very quickly, that involved the creation of existing structures, that is the maintenance of existing structures and integrating them into a national entity. I think this was the dilemma that we Americans faced going into Afghanistan, that there was not that existing structure that we could build upon. They found a mixture of allies here and there, warlords, sometimes gangsters, different types of people, and they cobbled them together and called them the government of Afghanistan. I read an interview with someone just yesterday who said there really never was a government of Afghanistan. Yeah. There was a kleptocracy, a group of people who just wanted to benefit from the American presence there, and they were called the government. And when the Americans withdrew, that non-government just disappeared. So I'm not sure what the alternative was. Very quickly, I used to tell my students, we went in to fight Al-Qaeda, and then suddenly we found ourselves at war with the Taliban. Exactly how did that happen? And so I think there were some dilemmas facing the Americans. I think they should have gotten out quicker. I think in retrospect, maybe even 10 years ago, we realized that. But once you're in, how do you get out without declaring yourself to be a loser? And that will cost you the next election.
Yeah. Sultan, I'll give you the final word then. Coming back to the Middle Eastern countries then, as you are well aware, Sultan, at this point in time, there are essentially sanctions against the Taliban government, even though, I mean, it has to be properly defined, I think, structure-wise. But the IMF has suspended its work with the Taliban, with the government of Afghanistan, I should say now, as well as, other sanctions, other countries, Western countries saying they will not recognize the Taliban in government as well. Is the Middle East going to then step up and ensure that the, for example, economy does not collapse? Because that's in everyone's interest in the region, isn't it?
Well, it's less likely, I would say, and probably I would even not encourage the Gulf countries to get involved at this stage. I think it's very, very important for the NATO countries led by the United States, who is, because of its pure weight in world economy, its influence at the Security Council and world politics and so on, and the way things have ended up, it's in their interest to really work with the Afghans in Afghanistan during this transitional phase. And I would say to leave the Arabs and the Middle East out of it for the time being. The real problem, I think, and if you allow me just to go back to the point you put it earlier, the real problem with the American style of doing things is not in the values they uphold, it's in the imposition of those values and in the lack of humility when they come to introduce those changes in the countries. And this is why they end up working with the ones that are willing to say yes. Those willing to say yes are also the ones who are willing and verify, to let them down. I would be the fastest to reach the exit and then blame the Americans for their rushed intervention. in America, there is no way for Afghanistan really economically to sort itself without the United States approval. All those freezing of accounts, including the IMF, the World Bank, the actual assets that the state owns, have happened with the American decision. It's not, all the other words don't really matter to be honest. And in the coming few days, there will be incredible pressure on the Taliban. And I think everybody now seems to be waiting for them to walk the talk. And I fear that the longer you wait, the smaller the window of opportunity there to make sure that the peaceful, so far, largely peaceful transition is actually solidified and allowed an opportunity. Very soon, the Taliban will discover that they have to bring in fuel into the country. Yeah. They have to pay for food. There are very, very complex issues. So far, they've shown the right signs in terms of keeping the bureaucracy intact. They haven't tried to do what the Americans did in Iraq of destroying the institutions and so on. But finance is very important. Afghanistan, 70% of its budget was reliant on international aid. Yeah. And it's unlikely to have changed over the last few days. If anything, it got worse. There are some really urgent humanitarian needs in the country. Yeah. These are all important, and the ones who are going to suffer from its failing are not going to be the Arab states in the first instance. It's going to be the neighboring countries to Afghanistan and maybe the European Union in terms of migration. It is very clear now that Iran would be willing to open its borders maybe to take refugees, but they will pass them on straight to Turkey straight to the EU. Indeed. So the time is right, I think, now to undertake collective action. Yeah. It doesn't have to be total sellout. It's not about embracing the Taliban fully, but it's continuing with the conversation, which I started by describing. It had really started back in 2013. And I'm someone who followed the process very, very closely, and I can tell you the Taliban leadership then and now have not changed, but they have evolved in their way of thinking, they understand better how the world is
All right,
working.
Sultan, I'm going to have to unfortunately cut you off. I do sincerely apologize. The clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate Sultan, Ronald, and Nazif for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to share their expertise with us. It was a wonderful conversation. We really were able to contextualize the situation from both the U.S. side and from the Middle Eastern point of view as well. What's happened in Afghanistan does affect the Middle East, even though, as Sultan there said, maybe it is smarter for the Middle Eastern countries not to be directly involved at this point in time. What is the U.S. legacy in the region? The U.S., is it completely stepping away? Probably not completely. I mean, it does have very important allies in the region. Nevertheless, its concentration is in other places. However, what it leaves behind does affect the way the rest of the world will hopefully look at the U.S. and learn the lessons of how the U.S. operates in countries that it goes into. Should the U.S. have remained involved for 2 decades in Afghanistan? These are all really, really important conversations. And again, they have regional, extra-regional implications as well for the rest of the world. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a report that's come out of Brookings Institute in the United States about multilateralism and globalization. I know these are very big, heavy words as well, and I don't want to get into a very technical discussion. And we want to keep these in as layman terms as we possibly can. But looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as just the overall global order of things. So, right, when we had Donald Trump in office in the United States, he really shook the world, or much of the world, in fact, that depended on multilateralism, as he brought in some fairly protectionist measures in the United States. However, it's not just down to Trump. There is also seemingly a bit of a Cold War happening between different trading powerhouses around the world as well. And this is obviously all to do with geopolitics, certainly at a certain level also. But when it came to the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, there has been some criticism of the fact that multilateralism didn't actually shape up in the way that one one would have hoped it would have, and reforms even at places like the IMF or other such big bodies such as the WTO and even the United Nations. In fact, if we're completely honest, reform has been very, very hard to come by because these are very rigid structures. We're going to put those issues as well as other issues to our esteemed panelists who are joining us today from around the world. We're joined by Dr. Peter Willetts, who is an Emeritus Professor of Global Politics at the University of London. He is joining us today from London, UK. Joining us from Amsterdam in the Netherlands is Dr. Kees van der Pijl, who is a Professor of International Relations and an author. And joining us from Melbourne, Australia is Dr. Joseph A. Camilleri, who is an Emeritus Professor at La Trobe University. Joseph, Kees, and Peter, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us today. Joseph, I'd like to start with you. Just using the pandemic as an example, did multilateralism/globalization fail to really do the best by everybody in that regard?
Well, of course, we're dealing with very complex issues which can't be easily pigeonholed or put into one box. But I think what we can say is, and globalization and multilateralism are really two, if you like, different sides of the coin. The question is not whether multilateralism as a concept has failed, but rather it is, I think, that states around the world are not truly tuned in to the major challenges we face, which are increasingly global in character, which of course pandemics would be one, COVID in particular at the moment, but climate change, refugee flows, massive displacement of people, and conflicts in different parts of the world. And clearly states, more often than not, are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I think this has been shown to be the case in the case of the pandemic. There's been insufficient understanding and real consultation and coordination between states and the governments which act on behalf of states, both within the so-called rich developing world, and indeed between them and the poorer or developing economies. And it should be said, not much evidence of effective collaboration even amongst the poorer developing economies of the world. So there's really been a lack of effective coordination, and because there are powerful interests which stand in the way of such effective coordination, which is really what multilateralism is supposed to be about. It's institutions bringing the various parties together in the hope that they can consult adequately and eventually reach some useful agreement and stick to the agreement and proceed with its implementation. But these powerful interests, which we can talk about in a minute, have stood in the way and to some considerable extent still stand in the way.
I brought up the example of Donald Trump in my introduction because I think he's probably the easiest person to pick on, right, when it came to somebody who went against the global order or the multilateral order as we understand it. Is it fair to put a lot at his feet, or do you think that the sort of order was sort of declining anyhow?
I think we have problems at a variety of levels in the system. And I think I would differ from the Brookings Institution in saying that we ought to have a wider concept of the global system. In the 1960s, the idea of transnational relations was introduced with an emphasis on big corporations. In the 1970s, the idea of interdependence was introduced with the idea that governments couldn't do things by themselves individually. And also under the idea of interdependence was the idea that governments have different ministries within countries which are rivals to each other, but they sometimes play out that rivalry in the international system. So that the ministers of finance might agree with something in the IMF, which they don't then find the health ministers endorse in the World Health Organization. And then the idea of international regimes, that For example, we have very, very strong global governance of international air safety. It's very specialist, but all pilots obey the rules of the International Civil Aviation Organization. And globalization is a term which was brought back to emphasize the growth and strength of transnational corporations. But there are other transnational actors as well, the international actors from civil society in each country. And I think Brookings should have included those, the transnational corporations and the transnational civil society. And that is where the term global governance came from. In 1992, there was a commission on global governance, which said we have to consider how the UN and its agencies and the other international institutions relate to the demands made by society. So then if we have this complex idea of the global system, and let's just take an example of climate change. Nobody would consider climate change without consulting the scientists. The same thing is true of pandemics. How could you possibly expect a government to deal with a pandemic without consulting epidemiologists? And so we need this wider concept of can governments do internationally what they've failed to do domestically? And can we get a wider engagement of other actors which will press governments to do the right thing?
Kees, let me bring you into the conversation as well from the Netherlands. What are your thoughts about where the global order has gone wrong, essentially? And I'm talking about then the example of the pandemic and climate change, because those seem to be the biggest issues right now, but certainly there are others, such as Afghanistan, etc.
I would say that we are actually experiencing now a dramatic instance of global governance on the basis of the global health regulations of 2005, when states signed up to binding commitments in the area of lockdowns, medicine and vaccine procurement, and so on. And all that is now being executed at the expense of democracy. Here in the Netherlands and in the EU at large, we are basically facing a seizure of power, I would say, by states acting in concert, although at the same time isolating themselves in the eyes of the population from other states. But there's no question that, for instance, the policies of France in introducing a vaccine passport and proposing to exclude people who don't want to be vaccinated from society are exactly the same as what is happening in Germany, what is happening in Italy, but also in our country, except that in every country a different tone and a different jargon is used to introduce effectively identical measures, because the political culture of every country is different, and people will accept certain measures. Let's say in France, when presented in a dictatorial tone of voice by Macron, whereas in the Netherlands it will always have to be presented as a sort of bargain that you can be part of. Of course, in France, people are not accepting what is presented to them, and I think the reality will soon become clear whether the dictatorship that's being imposed in the name of health in France, Italy, and the wider EU, because I think Europe is really at the heart of the whole enterprise, although Australia and New Zealand are setting examples of absurdity that I had never expected to come from that part of the world.
Right.
It will be decided here, you know, and I also am convinced it will fail with a terrible human and at a terrible cost in terms of the general mental health of the population.
Joseph, you back in, because, you know, I wonder, on that point of Kees about exclusionary practices, right? So that seems to have been the trend, right? Even before the pandemic to an extent. And when we're talking about, for example, the refugee crisis and the reactions to that, and I don't want to get into a very political discussion about that, but just the trend seems to be on the part of every country to, as much as these countries may say we are for globalization, we are for a multilateral system, but the truth is that even when it came to the vaccines, that there was hoarding, even as the WHO said, and that there are still many countries around the world, or still many citizens of certain countries around the world that have not even received a first dose, even though they may want one, you know, those who are at least willing to be vaccinated. Is this just then the trend that we're going to continue seeing, this sort of exclusionary nature of things?
Well, I think there are a number of questions here. I think governance is in terrible straits the world over, with some few notable exceptions. That is to say, I think governments, and I'm thinking of the whole political package, including institutions, in my view, are no longer fit for purpose. The institutions that we have in both advanced capitalist societies and in developing ones are really not up to the task of handling the very complex problems that we currently face. And there are certain questions which can only be dealt effectively, quickly or effectively, by extensive consultation and with a great number of actors, as Peter was saying a little while ago. So you need to take on board what your own nation, your own people are thinking, but you also need to take into account the concerns and the interests of a larger entity we call humanity. Because when we're dealing with climate change, with mass displacement of people, with pandemics, it's not just this particular part of the world, this country, or that region, whose interests and welfare are at stake. And therefore, what I'm trying to say is we have a failure that comes from a deficit in mindset, a deficit in institutional equipment. Let's not forget that even in the most sophisticated so-called societies, the institutions go back to about 200 or more years when they came largely in order to deal with the challenges of the Industrial Revolution and the breakdown of the feudal system. Yeah. But we now live in an entirely different world, and I think the institutions we have at national level and local level, let alone international level, are simply not tuned to the scope or the nature of the challenges we face.
Peter, I'm going to ask you about, global governance again, and I'm just using the pandemic as an example because there is this argument made, right, when it comes to the vaccines, and again, it's an example which is easier to hone in on because it was such an obvious one that came out, that when the vaccine hoarding happened, there was an argument that, listen, every country, every government is at the end of the day responsible for their own citizens, right? They're not responsible for the whole world. I mean, they're responsible firstly towards their citizens, and then, once they're vaccinated, then they can take care of the rest of the world. So, I mean, within that, then how do we find a balance? How do we remain within this multilateral system and in this very interconnected world where if a virus continues to remain, then there will be variants? At least that's the argument on the part of doctors and scientists and specialists, as well as then taking care of one's own citizens. Peter?
That is, in a way, the most horribly difficult question that one has to answer about the future of global governance. And one essentially has, at the society level, the balance between the individual and the collective good. And one has at the global level, the balance between what each country might have a consensus about and what is the global common good. And those things interact very intimately. I was very upset to hear the extreme libertarian idea of freedom put forward by Kees, because I think the freedom of the individual to do whatever they wish to do at the expense of the freedom of other people, in other words, the freedom to not wear masks, the freedom to travel as you wish, with the result you might kill somebody else by transferring the pandemic to them, is something that should be constrained, and constraint by governments for the general good enhances the overall freedom of everybody, because freedom from death is the most important freedom we can have. It's more important than freedom of speech. And the same thing applies at the global level. How can we protect ourselves in Britain, for example, with a high vaccination rate? Should we allow older people such as myself to have a booster jab when in fact there are large parts of Africa where hardly anybody's had a jab?
Yeah.
And the choice for the common good should be that there comes a point when each country says, we will have no more vaccines ourselves, we will give the vaccines to other countries where more people's lives can be saved. And the politics of doing that is extremely difficult. And it can only be done by both the governments reaching agreement and a general sort of consensus within global civil society. A very nebulous idea, global civil society, but it is nevertheless a reality.
Okay, Kees, some final word before I let all three of you go. I'll let you, of course, respond to Pijl there, him essentially talking about, we need to take the collective good as well into account. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I fully agree, but you can't pose questions like that in an abstract way. We're talking about vaccination, but in fact, the companies who are providing this have made very clear it's not a vaccine in the traditional sense. It's an experimental gene therapy that has been made available on a temporary license. To begin experimenting with that on a scale that's happening now is actually putting the survival of humanity at risk. And eminent specialists like Luc Montagnier, the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the HIV virus, have said that the variants are actually the result of the so-called vaccines. Now, what is the general interest of humanity here? Freedom of death when we are dispensing, possibly, I don't know, but possibly, death bringing experimental medicine on a large scale. In a year's time, we should have this conversation again, and then break out of the. I respect the wisdom of Joe Camilleri and Peter Willetts very much, but it cannot remain abstract. It has to be made concrete in the circumstances that we are experiencing now, and which are in themselves life-threatening, because tens of thousands of people have already died as a result of unforeseen effects of the so-called vaccines. Now, that is also a general interest, but you must begin by first naming these things. You cannot just speak about a general interest in the abstract and overlook what is happening at the same time.
Okay. All right, we're going to have to leave that, but we really appreciate Kees, Peter, and Joseph for taking their time out of their busy schedules to discuss the issues that we were able to highlight there. I know it was a shorter conversation, but we were able to essentially talk about more just the pandemic, and of course some of our guests are mentioned climate change and other such connected issues as well. The world is facing some very heavy-duty issues. The answers are not easy. These are complex issues. There is the issue of the greater good, as Peter there had mentioned. There are concerns about the vaccines, as Kees there mentioned. I mean, that's not a small thing. Those are significant concerns on the part of some people and even some experts who I've also spoken to. But nevertheless, somehow we need to work together, right? We need to continue to work together, because that's the only way, for example, we've seen that we can come out of the pandemic, or really we can only overcome climate change too by working together. So we're going to have to get beyond our differences, political differences many times. We cannot sideline whole countries just because we disagree with them on an adversarial political level, but because these are things which are, and go back to something that Peter said, for the greater good, and that is something that we have to keep in mind at all times. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.